Great. I'm going to share my screen. Awesome. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for the BERDO Review Board meeting. My name is Diana Vasquez. I'm the BERDO Review Board manager. I will lead us in a vote for acting chair. Do any of the board members want to make a nomination for acting chair today? Oops.
Nominate Stephen Ellis for acting chair.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. I will now lead us in a vote. How do you vote for the motion to nominate Board Member Ellis to serve as acting chair? Board Member Boatwright?
In favor.
Board Member Ellis?
In favor.
Board Member Ferris?
In favor.
Board Member Lattimore?
In favor.
And Board Member Stillwell?
In favor.
Awesome. I will now hand the meeting over to Board Member Ellis.
Thank you, Diana. Okay, good afternoon. I am calling this public meeting to order at 4:46 p.m. in accordance with the Building Emission Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance regulations adopted pursuant to the Building Emission Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance, Boston City Code, Ordinances Section 7-2.2. The BERDO Review Board will hold a virtual public hearing at 4:30 p.m. on March 24th to review the following topics in regards to the reduction of greenhouse gases from building energy production and consumption so as to promote the public health and welfare of Boston residents. In accordance with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Executive Order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, we are conducting this public meeting online. To ensure public access to the deliberations of the BERDO Review Board, the public may access this call through telephone and video conferencing. Members of the public will have an opportunity to ask questions and provide public comment. To do so, please raise your hand or type in the chat in the application via the Zoom meeting platform. If you are calling in and cannot use the platform, you can raise your hand by pressing *9 or send your questions to staff via email at berdoreviewboard@boston.gov. For the record, I'm Stephen Ellis, acting chair of the board. I will now conduct a roll call of board members. Board members, please say your name in the order that they appear on the slide.
Jessica Boatwright.
Stephen Ellis,
Lori Ferris.
Gail Lattimore.
thank you. And before you move on, I just want to...
I'm sorry.
No problem. I apologize, Reggie. All right, before we move on, I just want to check with the Environment Department in case the council has joined.
The counselor has not joined yet.
Not a problem. Staff will now introduce themselves.
Hannah Payne, Director of Carbon Neutrality in the Environment Department.
Apologies, Diana Vasquez, BERDO Review Board Manager with the Environment Department.
Claudia Martinez, Policy and Equity Advisor, Environment Department.
Here is the agenda for today's meeting. We are going to start with a hearing, or possibly may reverse that, but a hearing to discuss Boston University's building portfolio and individual compliance schedule application. Then we will switch to our public meeting where we will continue the previous meeting's discussion and vote on opening the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund for the 2025 application cycle. After, we will approve the meeting minutes from March 10th, hear administrative updates, and finally adjourn the meeting. I'm going to pause for a moment to turn over to Diana. What would you suggest we do for this moment in time?
Yes, I think we should switch, unfortunately, the agenda items to start with the discussion and vote on opening the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. Apologies, Boston University, we are going to have to switch the agenda items around. Originally, we wanted B to go first, but I think this will help with facilitating acting chair your ability to recuse yourself during the meeting.
Very well. To ensure that we have quorum, and hopefully the council will be able to join. So I am actually going to switch, as you suggested, over to the discussion for the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. So I'll wait a moment while we get to that slide, and I'll start.
Apologies. We're gonna have to go through many slides. Actually, that's a better way of doing it. Oops. Mhm.
All right, we will now switch to our public meeting. I am calling this public meeting to order at 4:51 p.m. And we will continue our discussion from the previous meeting about opening up the next application cycle for the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. I will now turn it over to Diana.
Great, thank you, Acting Chair. Hi, everyone. So I will be presenting on the city's proposal for the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund for the 2025 application cycle. So I just wanted to start one by reminding folks we had our first application cycle last year. So the fund is a new fund that was created with the passage of BERDO or BERDO 2.0. The review board has authority over making funding decisions of the fund. And last year we had our first application cycle. And so we're now in 2025, and this will be opening the second cycle of the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. We sent out a sort of preliminary survey of sorts to the board members to sort of get a feel for any sort of priorities that folks may have for this year. Based on those responses, we think that this application cycle would prioritize buildings that are one, subject to BERDO, so buildings that are at least 20,000 square feet, or multifamily buildings that have 15 or more units, commercial buildings and residential buildings. And there seemed to be appetite for projects that are for funding projects that are related either to energy efficiency improvements, renewable energy procurement, fuel switching or sort of switching from fossil fuel to electrification, and supporting workforce development. And then one additional item that we found from the survey is there was an ask to allow applicants from previous rounds to roll over their applications to this funding round if they are interested in doing so. And so we thought that made sense, and so we proposed that as well. So that we could reach out to folks who applied last year and ask if they're still interested. They could roll over their applications to this funding round. So with all of that being said, this is sort of the proposal that we are bringing to the board today. We could release a grant announcement with a date opening the application on Monday, March 31st. So that would be a week from today. Have it open for 2 months, close the application on Friday, May 30th. The eligible applicants would be very similar to last year. So nonprofit organizations, again, having that opportunity for eligible applicants from last year to roll over their applications if they still have very similar projects and still are interested in funding. And then eligible projects must include reductions in building emissions in Boston. So some sort of building decarbonization aspect or something that reduces emissions in buildings, and must include benefits to environmental justice populations in the city and populations disproportionately impacted by air pollution. And this is just an example of what the grant announcement front page would look like. And for this second cycle, we're proposing very similar to last year, using a Google form to input responses and questions from our updated grant announcement. So the grant announcement would have sort of like the guidelines of what we're looking for in the submitted project proposal. Of course, knowing that we can also work with anyone who can't, would prefer an alternative method of submission. If a Google form doesn't work for you, we're happy to work with you and figure out a way to do that. And for awards, we are asking the board to release $750,000 with a preference of making multiple awards around $250,000. So very similar again to last year. That's sort of how it shook out last year. But with the caveat that it's subject to change based on the applications that are received and the board's discretion. We are also planning, if the board agrees, to release a frequently asked questions, so sort of FAQs for people who are interested, and we would host 2 information sessions for interested parties. Both would be virtual over Zoom, and folks could register ahead of time and send questions ahead of time if they would like, or they could just show up and we would, present some 101 and answer questions in real time. And this is sort of the proposed timeline. So as I mentioned, opening on March 31st, having those 2 information sessions, one on April 15th and one on April 23rd, close the application on May 30th, and then have a review period of June and July to sort of have the time for board members to review applications, make a vote, and hopefully have awards announced in August. So all of that being said, here's the proposal that the City of Boston is putting towards the board for the 2025 Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. The proposal is that the review board allocate $750,000 for the second application cycle, with a preference to grant multiple awards of approximately $250,000, and noting that the application period would be open from March 31st through May 30th, 2025. And now I will hand over to you, Acting Chair Ellis.
Thank you, Diana. For the record, I would just like to acknowledge that Councilor Coletta Zapata has now joined us online, and so just want to call that out. So I will now ask each board member if they have any questions or comments regarding what the city has proposed regarding the fund for 2025, the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. So I will start with you, board member Boatwright.
I have 2 questions. Do you want me to do one and then wait, or do both of them?
You can do both of them right now if you would like.
Okay. First question is, for people who want to roll over an application, will they have an opportunity to submit supplemental materials, or will they have to pick between either rolling over or submitting a wholly new application?
Yeah, I can say what I was envisioning, and then obviously happy to take feedback. I think we were going to reach out to each applicant. It wasn't a too big of a number that it would be too much of a hassle to reach out to each applicant and sort of ask, hi, we're opening up the second application. If you'd like, you can roll over your application, but if there are anything that's amended or updated, happy to send you what you submitted before and sort of be the foundation for your next application cycle. But I think we would probably ask them to refill the Google form.
Yeah, I think it would be important to make sure that, when you do all the official RFP releasing actions, that if the intention is that it's less work for somebody to roll over, that they have that opportunity to do less work. My second question is, last year, were there any timing issues where there were applicants who needed to hear back from BERDO in order to apply for any additional funding? And if so, are we able to meet any of those with this proposed timeline?
Yeah, that's a good question. Fortunately, there didn't seem to be any timing issues last year, but that may have been because it was the first round and maybe, no one was necessarily planning on the fund. So no planning issues last year. I will say we're proposing extending it to 2 months because last year we proposed opening it for 6 weeks and we heard pretty clearly that that was not enough time. And so we're hoping 2 months may be better.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, board member Boatwright. Councilor Coletta Zapata, any questions for the city?
No, thank you. I just want to thank city staff for pulling this together and all the work that they do. And just apologies for being late, but no questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilor. A couple of questions that I have for the city staff. Diana, can you please remind us why we are only allowed to offer funding for nonprofits, just so the public can have that reminder, please?
Yes. So the current money in the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund was seeded by the mayor and the city council. and it was sourced from operating dollars essentially. And the state of Massachusetts has sort of limitations on how public funding can be used. Specifically, it's the anti-aid amendment. And because our projects for the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund have to be related to building decarbonization, the public purpose needs to be very clear. And we find that working with nonprofits is sort of a easy way to ensure that the public purpose is quite clear with projects that are funded with the money. But Hannah or Claudia, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I would just add that, yeah, there's additional screening that we do for each project to make sure that they serve a public purpose, and that, you know, we try to give those guidelines up front as much as possible so that applicants know, that applicants know what might be eligible. But if folks have questions about that too and are thinking about applying, we also encourage you to reach out and talk to us, because it can get a little bit tricky to figure out that line of what a public purpose is, but that's why we're limiting it to nonprofits for now. In the future, when the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund is coming from alternative compliance payments, we don't expect that this will be a similar issue.
Thank you, Hannah and Diana. Not having a public period, I'm just going to answer the question that was put in the chat by Eve Torrey. The answer to your question, Eve, is that we are deciding and discussing to allocate $750,000 in the second application cycle, similar to the first, and the preference would be going toward multiple grant awards of approximately $250,000. So essentially, that might be 3 projects, depending on how at minimum 3 projects, depending on how we divvy up the fund. Diana, can you please go back to the survey responses that were provided by the board, knowing that we're sort of also trying to discuss something along the lines of what the fund should be focused on. I want to hold on to this slide for one moment, but before I ask my question in regards to what's here, one thing that I would like to suggest is to have the city ensure that while they are going out into the communities to you know, help folks with BERDO. I know that you sent us an email that you'll be in the South End and downtown and several other parts of Boston, that you will in fact talk about the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. Although we only have virtual options, I just want to make sure that we are able to maximize the opportunity that we have with members of the public when you're meeting with them in person. So that's just one thing that I would ask for from the Environment Department. Seeing you nod your head, that's great. In terms of how to prioritize, just to remind the board, last year when we did this, we ended up falling into a bit of agreement here where we prioritized projects that were associated with BERDO buildings alone, as opposed to the entire city of Boston. And so, you know, this is an opportunity for board members to also discuss or ask any questions of the city in regarding their perspective, or also sharing your own perspective about what you think we should focus on. So I will now pause and turn it over to Board Member Ferris to see if you have any questions or comments.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess related to the comment you just made, I'm curious about prioritizing buildings subject to BERDO, given the amount of built environment in Boston that is not subject to BERDO, particularly in environmental justice areas, what the kind of logic is for prioritizing BERDO buildings through this funding.
I can jump, and then environment staff, I hope you can provide additional context. I think my impression, and I know Board Member Lattimore, you know, I know you'll probably share your perspective as well when we get to it. But what happened last time was that, you know, this was the first time that the fund was being released, and we were also trying to get an understanding as to what kind of applications would be coming to us. And quite a few of those applications had to do with retrofit studies and really trying to understand how to help the existing buildings that are multifamily housing that are subjected to BERDO that were also existing in environmental justice communities. And so at the time, we honestly just fell into an agreement that we wanted to focus on that for the first application cycle. That's not to say that we need to focus on the exact same thing in the second application cycle, but it was just where we fell. So I do think, Board Member Ferris, what you're asking can also be applied to say, you know, can we have this fund focused a little bit more broadly on environmental justice communities, whether or not they are a part of the BERDO covered buildings list. I hope I'm capturing that correctly, Board Member Ferris.
Yes, that makes sense. Thank you.
Environmental staff, would you have anything else that you would like to add?
No, I think that makes sense. And I'll just say, basically, another way to reiterate what Board Member Ellis or Acting Chair Ellis has mentioned, uh, the regulations themselves don't prohibit the use of the fund for buildings that are not subject to BERDO. It just sort of seemed there was a the board coalesced around that last year. But there is nothing prohibiting that.
Any other questions or comments, Board Member Ferris?
No, thanks. That's it.
Thank you. Board Member Lattimore, over to you.
Yes, thank you. And I definitely think that agree that we can look at this in different ways, but definitely also appreciate the subject to BERDO, because I imagine, I'm not sure if this is correct, but I imagine that BERDO buildings represent the largest share of emissions. And so that might be another reason why. And so I definitely appreciate the environmental justice community, perspective, absolutely. And as BERDO buildings that are larger are decarbonized or made to have their emissions reduced, that's going to impact everyone in the city. So so in any case, I do have a question. I just wonder what the balance was on the Equitable Emissions Fund.
Sure. One second. I'll look it up.
Mm-hmm. And while you're looking that up, I don't believe, but I could be wrong, that we have been receiving any alternative compliance payments yet, correct?
That is correct, Board Member Lattimore.
Yeah, so then that would be, I would think that if, depending on the trend for the ACPs, then that might be a way of, thinking about, this issue even further, seeding the fund and how we start dividing the pie. So, but that was my only question and was the balance on the fund. So I'll just await that answer and thank you.
Yes. So, uh, so what we have encumbered, so meaning the amount that we already have reserved for something else, even though they may not have been totally paid out yet, we have 2 million, about a little over $2,077,000 left in the fund currently.
Excuse me, that's unencumbered, meaning doesn't include the ones that we've already committed, that
Or
balance.
it is encumbered.
I'm sorry, it includes, the 2 million includes the 750 that we already, so it's after we release those funds, it would be 1.25 million.
Oh, oh, sorry. In that case, I mean the opposite. So it already takes into account the 750.
Great. All right, got it. Thank you. No more questions.
Thank you, Board Member Lattimore. And just to be clear, so that number includes what was already, the number excludes what was already released in round one. Is that correct, Diana? I
Correct.
see you nodding. Okay, thank you. All right, now over to you, Board Member Stovall.
I just wanted to ask why we came to the figure of 700 and, well, not 750, but the $250,000 disbursements.
Yeah. I think last year wanted to see sort of what would be sort of the appetite for folks who might submit applications. And I think we were also a little bit, I don't want to say nervous, but also knowing that we probably won't get alternative compliance payments at the earliest until next year, also wanted to hopefully keep the fund um, with a pretty decent balance. And so that's how we ended up with 750 last year. And then I should also note last year the board also released $500,000 to help support what we called the Building Decarbonization Advisor Program. So it helps support provides free zero overtime services for certain building owners, so eligible building owners in the city. So last year the board actually ended up releasing 1.25 million, if I'm doing my math right. Um, so it seemed like it was a good amount. It seemed like 250 seemed like a good amount that applicants were interested in. And so it was mostly, the short answer, it was a guesstimate of what we thought would be um worthwhile for applicants, but still keep the fund with a pretty healthy balance.
Okay, so in other words, being able to disperse it and try to keep the goal the longest way. I understand that. I just was thinking maybe, maybe smaller versus larger to help a few more people. But I guess we're targeting any building with more than 10,000 square feet. That's all the only question I really had. I was just trying to figure out why so much, but maybe it's not, after looking at what we're replacing, I see, it could be quite expensive if we did a solar array or something like that. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Stovall. I actually want to add additional context here. The board also wanted to be able to make sure that we're able to provide funding to multiple projects. I see Board Member Lattimore's hand up, and I'll get you in a moment. But when we say the intention is to cap it at 250, a member of the community, of the nonprofit community, could ask for less than $250,000, and that could allow it for us to split it up even more. But from our training and conversations, and Board Member Lattimore can probably enlighten us a little bit more, most of these retrofit projects or even studies cost north of several $100,000s, and that's where we sort of had to figure out how to divide that up and make sure that we're not allowing the $750,000 to just go towards one project, that we could at least at minimum have three. So I'll pause there for Board Member Lattimore if you would like to provide additional context.
Well,
Thank you
you pretty much covered it. Thank you, Acting Chair. That you were going to. I was going to say something similar. These projects are very expensive and it well exceed in most cases the 250K limit. But there is an argument that could be made for smaller projects, particularly as smaller amounts, particularly as we look at non-BERDO buildings.
Thank you.
Okay. And Board Member Stovall, as we go through this, if you would like to make a suggestion that, 250 for two projects and then the remaining 250 divvy up in a larger or smaller way, I should say, amongst a unique subset of projects, I think we're also willing to accept that. So I'll pause to see if you have any other sort of recommendations for right now.
That's what I was kind of thinking, but I didn't say it. Even if you could just, maybe a smaller building, maybe you could give it to split it, like you said, one of the grants in half, and that would help. We'd be helping an extra person that might not need quite as much. You know what I'm saying? Maybe just a conversion for a heating system or just adding some panels. That was just my thought, but I mean, we could keep it the same way, but maybe just split maybe one of them to 125 or, whatever we could try to get away with to just help one more entity or one more nonprofit that really could stand to help with their utilities, especially with climate change and in the climate of the government right now, the federal government. That might just be one thing that could hold a nonprofit in place for another year or two, just by not having to deal with the high cost of paying for their utilities or whatever way we can help them. That's my opinion.
Thank you, Board Member Stovall. To the Environment Department, is there a way, I know that we're seeking to vote on this today, but is there a way to amend the language slightly a bit so that we're talking, and I think it may cover what Board Member Stovall is saying, but one aspect is in terms of your engagement with the community, that, we don't necessarily just focus on saying we're trying to give out $250,000 and that your project needs to, be within that range, but maybe amending the language so that when you're speaking to community members as well as nonprofits, that they know that they don't need to come and ask or come up with a project that's 250,000. If they just need 10,000 for some sort of workforce development workshop, maybe is there a way to amend that language today so that before we vote on it, that we have something appropriate?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's doable. We could say, um, we currently have language that says, the amount may vary based on the board's discretion, but we could also update language to say something like, uh, preference is to make two awards of about $250,000, and maybe two awards of around 115,000, something along those lines. I don't think that would be very difficult to do.
Thank you, Diana. Board Member Lattimore?
Perhaps what I'm about to say is for discussion after a motion is made. I was just going to make a counterpoint to the issue of non-BERDO buildings or smaller buildings being funded, or smaller properties or projects being funded. So I don't know if this is the right time or to wait until.
I do believe that we're in the middle of a discussion period, so I think your comments are welcome now if you would like to present a comment.
Okay, and maybe I didn't understand board member Stovall's comment very well. If it is for smaller landlords, then I think that we should look at if there are any other city programs available, especially for mom and pop type landlords. But I don't know if that's what board member Stoll was getting at or not. If it's more for like larger owners, BERDO owners that are nonprofits that, are serving a significant number of folks and whose buildings, because of their size and scale, have significant emission issues. Then I'm more open to smaller grants, but I would argue that, if it's mom and pop oriented, other programs of the city or state might be applicable, like Solar for All, and there's a number of other programs I think that are there for smaller owners of properties, particularly 1 to 4 family. But again, I might have misunderstood board member Stovall's representation of that issue.
I think I'll comment here. Board Member Lattimore, how I'm interpreting Board Member Stovall's comment is more so allowing for a little bit more flexibility in the language in terms of how folks approach this application. I do believe that in the application process, and the city can confirm this or let me know if it's not there. One of the questions that we ask applicants is what other funding sources are you seeking, or what other funding sources you've applied for? And if there's some sort of express that it's been difficult to get, say, federal funding, which I heard Board Member Stovall allude to, then, let's not have this sort of only for large properties and only for BERDO building. Let's make sure that we ensure are broadening our scope a little bit to allow for some wiggle room for those that may be struggling, that may not exist as a BERDO building or as a nonprofit supporting a very large organization. And please correct me, Board Member Stovall, if I'm capturing that correctly.
You captured it exactly the same way I was thinking it. Thank you.
Thanks for the clarification.
Thank you, board members. I actually want to turn back to Board Member Boatwright just for one moment, because I know all of this sort of came up after you having gone first, and just want to check if you have any other question, but I can also open the floor to any other board members, but starting with you, Board Member Boatwright, just to go back around one more time. Do you have any other questions or comments?
No, I'm good. I know this is a complicated process, but this has been a helpful discussion. I don't have additional questions.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other further questions or comments from Board Member Ferris? There we go.
Sorry, I do have one more question. I remember last year it was clear that the funds could be used for planning activities, and they could be used by nonprofits who maybe don't own buildings, but who serve a large constituency of building owners. And it looks like the recommendations this year are mute on both of those points. So I just wanted to ask if that was deliberate, or if there is an intention to focus towards building owners, or to allow those to kind of leave those allowances for planning projects or other nonprofits that serve multiple owners to stay in place this year.
I'll hand that over to either Diana or Hannah.
Yeah. In terms of the sort of first question around can nonprofits who don't necessarily own buildings directly, but sort of service or have services and programs related to sort of decarbonization work, definitely they are eligible. They can apply. I think from the city's perspective, like we think that would be great. We found last year there were a ton of applications like that, but obviously would welcome those applications this year. Um, and I apologize, I forgot what was the second question.
Planning, whether the funds could be used for planning phase services or enabling scope.
Oh, yes. Based on the survey, it seemed like there was a preference for quote unquote like shovel-ready projects, but I don't think that excludes like planning or scoping. What I will say is last year, I think once the applications were submitted, it was easier to kind of see how many projects are in the planning phase, how many projects are in like the design phase, how many projects are in like the quote unquote shovel ready phase. And I think based on the applications that we got last year, a lot more applications tended to be more in the shovel ready phase or in projects that already had started and had a timeline. But that does not exclude, projects that are not in that phase by any means.
I would also just add that we have the Building Decarbonization Advisor Program, which provides those zero overtime plans to eligible building owners. And then also we have additional funding for ARPA eligible building owners that can get like additional planning and scoping. So that is an additional funding source, just so the board is aware of those resources too. Not to say that you couldn't also choose to award scoping money to projects through this grant round, but there are some other avenues as well.
Thank you. I guess I would just suggest again in communicating with the public that there's clarity. I think that was helpful last year to have clarity of what were and were not eligible in terms of the phase of the work and the type of applicant. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Board Member Ferris. And so just to hopefully I'm capturing this in my recap here. Can you go back to that survey response slide one more time? Sorry. So what I'm hearing as a slight amendment here is not just properties that are subjected to BERDO, but properties that exist within EJ communities may need to be added to that first section. And then projects that are include those four, but as Board Member Ferris has suggested, maybe just typing out the language scoping and making sure that that is clear to the public as well. Are there any other questions or comments, or am I missing anything, fellow board members? Okay, and on the subsequent slide, if you can go to the slide after the timeline, please. All right, so the slide amendment here is sort of amending to essentially say that this is granting 2 dupe awards up to $250,000, and then sort of a subsequent award that are a bit smaller, splitting along that line that Diana was talking about, I think 110, 115. But if it needs to be much more looser or open than that, then I think the city staff will be allowed to do that based on this conversation. Okay, I see you nodding. So in terms of making our push for a motion in terms of deciding what is the appropriate motion here, Diana or Hannah?
Yeah, I think the motion language should say, I make a motion to allocate $750,000 for the second application cycle, with a preference to make multiple awards, 2 of around 250, a final 250 into smaller chunks, with the amendments said by Acting Chair Ellis. I know that's a mouthful. I could say that proposal language, and someone could say, I I make a motion to approve as as described by Diana.
Okay, let me take a stab at this. Is there a motion to approve opening the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund cycle for 2025, where the board will allocate $750,000 in the second cycle with a preference for 2 awards focused on $250,000 and the subsequent awards splitting the remaining $250,000 for smaller projects? And this period would be open from March 31st through May 30th, 2025.
We'll make a motion.
Is there a second?
I second it.
On the motion to approve the city proposal as mentioned, how do you vote, Board Member Boatright?
In favor.
How do you vote, Councilor Coletta Zapata? Sorry, was that in favor? I couldn't hear that unless everyone else heard it. Okay, I can hear in favor. It's a little choppy, but I am also in favor. Board Member Ferris,
In favor.
Board Member Lattimore,
Abstain.
Board Member Stovall.
In favor.
The ayes have it, the motion passes. The next cycle of the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund will release $750,000 and the application will be open from March 31st through May 30th, 2025. Diana, just checking our order here. Should we do the meeting minutes and then have me recuse myself, or what would you prefer?
I think we have folks here. We can go straight to the BU meeting if that works for you, Acting Chair.
That's not a problem. All right. As acting chair, I would like to recuse myself from the agenda item, that is Boston University's application, and appoint Jessica Boatwright to serve as chair pro tem and preside over this application while I am recusing myself. Are there any objections from other board members regarding this appointment? If not, I can hand the meeting over to board now chair, Boatwright.
Great. Thank you, Board Member Ellis. So since we have a quorum now, I am going to begin the hearing by calling on the Boston University team to do their presentation.
Sorry, just very quickly, the Environment Department had planned some sort of reminders of applications for building portfolios right ahead, so to sort of intro and contextualize Pathway 3.
Great.
And so just a reminder for building portfolios, there are 4 application pathways, Pathway 0 being one that is, one where there are multiple buildings that equal on a single parcel that equal at least 20,000 square feet or at least 15 units. No hearing is required for that approval. Pathway 1 are buildings that are individually subject to BERDO, but do not trigger sort of that environmental justice requirement. No hearing is required for those approvals either. We have Pathway 2, which are buildings that are individually subject to BERDO and do sort of trigger the environmental justice requirements, and the review board may vote to hold a hearing. And then finally, we have Pathway 3, so buildings that are subject to BERDO but maybe don't meet one of the eligibility criteria for applying, or the owner is also applying for an individual compliance schedule at the same time, and the review board shall hold a hearing. So that is what BU is doing today. They're applying for both a portfolio and an individual compliance schedule. And then just a quick reminder, so because it's Pathway 3, we're having a hearing today. The applicant presents on their application, sort of gives us a summary of their application. The review board accepts public comments, and then the review board may vote to approve with standard conditions, approve with special conditions, or deny the application. The board may also vote to continue an application. And then as a reminder, special conditions, these are relevant to the distribution of decarbonization benefits, so the benefits that would be associated with the decarbonization plan, to environmental justice populations based on the makeup of the building portfolio. And the applicant and the review board must agree to the special conditions before a vote for approval can take place. And so if special conditions were going to be proposed, that would sort of continue the hearing until both the applicant and the board came to an agreement on those special conditions. Okay, and now I will hand it over to BU.
Thank you, Diana. And thank you all for inviting us to speak on Boston University's BERDO portfolio and ICS applications. My name is Dennis Carlberg. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for Boston University. I'm joined by Gabrielle Brewer, our Sustainability Analyst, who does our BERDO reporting. Next slide. Here is the agenda for our presentation. I would like to begin by thanking the Environment Department, Hannah, Claudia, and the rest of the carbon neutrality team for their responsive engagement with the Boston Green Ribbon Commission Higher Ed Working Group throughout the process of developing the ordinance and the regulations. I would also like to thank Diana and the BERDO team for their responsiveness to the myriad questions we have had throughout our reporting process. So let's get started. Next. Our climate action
continue. Oh, before you continue, I'm not seeing the presentation. I don't know if staff is pulling it up or if BU is pulling it up.
Staff is pulling it up.
Yes, I'm sharing my screen. Do you see the slides? No.
I can see it.
There
Yeah.
may be a tab function at the top of your screen that might show the difference between the meeting and the presentation, perhaps. I know I've run into this issue myself.
Oh, I apologize. I see it. Wait, I got it. I don't know how I hit that button. Thank you very much. Sorry, apologies. Please continue.
Okay, thank you. So our climate action plan was approved by our Board of Trustees in 2017. It set 5 high-level goals. Number 1, to prepare for the impacts from climate change that can no longer be avoided. Number 2 is to get to net zero direct emissions for the university's operations by 2040. Number 3 is to act on indirect emissions. Those emissions we compel by how we move, what we buy, and what we waste. Number 4 is to better integrate climate change into our educational or research missions. And then 5 is to integrate the climate action plan itself into the university's strategic plan. For the purposes of BERDO, getting to net zero direct emissions by 2040 is the focus. Next. This graph is our greenhouse gas abatement curve. The vertical axis represents emissions, horizontal years. The shades of gray are our fossil fuel emissions from various sources. The colored wedges represent the strategies for achieving net zero emissions by 2040. Next. The first strategy is to reduce emissions through energy efficiency, then shift from fossil fuel use to electricity for heating where possible to enable the transition to renewables. We are sourcing renewable energy to match 100% of the university's electricity demand, and we are electrifying BU's fleet over time. Next. By 2023, we have reduced our emissions by 65%. Next. 100% of the electricity the university uses, can you see it? 100% of the electricity the university uses is matched by the BU Wind project. BU's 205 million kilowatt hour power purchase agreement is the second largest single active PPA by any college or university in the EPA's Green Power Partnership, and puts BU in the partnership's top 100, along with Google, Microsoft, and Walmart. BU Wind was honored by the EPA in 2021 with the EPA Green Power Leadership Award. Next. BU is also installing solar on campus. Current installations are generating over 1.1 million kilowatt hours a year. Next. Our climate action plan set LEED Gold as the standard. Our Center for Computing and Data Sciences has achieved LEED Platinum with 10 points to spare. The university began LEED certification for major projects in 2008 and now has nearly 2 million square feet of LEED certified space, 89% of which has achieved LEED Gold or Platinum. Gabrielle, over to you. Next.
Thank you, Dennis. I am now going to talk about Boston University's building portfolio and individual compliance schedule applications. Next slide. For visual context, before I get into this section, this map shows all of Boston University's buildings in both Boston and Brookline in gray. The 2 central heating plants are in red here, which are also BERDO buildings. Next slide. These are the 25 BERDO properties attached to the central heating plants. These 2 clusters of buildings make up the 2 heating districts in our portfolio. one on West Campus and one on Central Campus. Next. And this shows all of the buildings in red here represent the Boston University BERDO buildings. You can see the medical campus, which is in the south end in the bottom left corner. Next. Boston University chose to utilize the Pathway 3 flexibility measure. A building portfolio allows us to make progress across the portfolio rather than needing to focus only on our buildings above target. BU can use a more strategic approach to decarbonization across campus rather than building by building. Additionally, placing our portfolio in an individual compliance schedule allows us to take advantage of the progress made to date. Next. In 2023, BU reported 107 buildings in total, but only 105 buildings will be included in the building portfolio. 665 Commonwealth Avenue is excluded because it has a baseline year after 2021, and 11 to 19 Deerfield because the building will be vacant for the foreseeable future. For the most part, the Charles River campus uses a 2006 baseline. Next slide. The medical campus uses a 2014 baseline because prior to 2014, the building's energy is largely aggregated, posing challenges for determining individual building use. Next slide. And the Fenway campus uses a 2019 baseline because it was acquired in 2018 and there being challenges with getting historical utility information prior to the acquisition. There are a mix of other baseline years due to building acquisitions and renovations throughout the portfolio. Boston University has used building designations that are based on each building's actual use type. Next slide. I will now run through our environmental justice maps. This is the environmental justice map with our BERDO building portfolio overlaid. The EJ layers shown here match the layers used in the City of Boston EJ mapping tool. We chose to create these maps internally rather than on the mapping tool to make it easier to see where our buildings lie. As you can see, 100% of our BERDO buildings are in environmental justice populations. As required by the regulations, the buildings are broken out by type. The light green building is one of the campus district energy systems. The light blue building is the other campus district energy system that is also a residential building. Yellow buildings are non-residential and pink are residential. Next slide. This is the asthma prevalence map. Next slide. The respiratory hazard. This is the only map where some of our buildings are located in an area without any hazard. Next. And lastly, this is the urban heat island effect map. Next. To show where BU stands with its upcoming compliance, this graph shows BU's projected emissions and targets based on the baseline metric tons of carbon that we submitted in our application. I will outline how we determined the baseline energy consumption and emissions in the next slide, but in a business as usual case, projecting our CY23 emissions reported to BERDO out to 2050, which you can see in pink, BU's above target reductions until 2040. Next slide. Boston University used internal utility reports from the baseline years to obtain baseline energy use and associated emissions. The utility reports have historically been compiled by exporting the energy consumption from utility bills stored in an energy billing management platform. The reports for the baseline years were scrubbed for just BERDO buildings, and the monthly billed use by meter at each BERDO property was provided as supporting documentation. Next slide. I will now transition to discuss the alternative emissions factors that BU has proposed. The regulations state that owners may propose alternative emissions factors to the review board, and the review board shall have the discretion to accept or deny alternative emissions factors. Boston University is proposing to use the Mass DEP emissions factors to determine baseline emissions. In 2009, Boston University began voluntarily reporting its greenhouse gas emissions. At that time, BU decided to use the Mass DEP electricity emissions factors because they are a better representation of specifically the Massachusetts electricity grid. Massachusetts alone contributes the highest level of emissions to the ISO New England grid. Knowing this, BU made the decision to hold itself accountable to the emissions generated in this state without claiming the lower emissions factors that take advantage of cleaner electricity production in other New England states. Even though these emissions factors are higher and have resulted in greater greenhouse gas emissions for the university, BU has always aimed to be as accurate, consistent, and transparent as possible, and we would like to continue this practice with BERDO. Next slide. Although not required to do so now, to be transparent, BU submitted a draft of its emission standard compliance plan with our application. In 2027, when the final submission is due, we will make any necessary changes. I will now hand it back to Dennis to look ahead at opportunities and challenges that we foresee. Next slide.
Thank you, Gabrielle. So now that you have a sense of the relationship between BU's climate action to date and BERDO, let me share with you how we plan to move forward next. Now that BU has reduced its emissions by 65%, frankly, the hardest work lies ahead. This January, we launched a working group to refine the climate action plan. With the university's electricity addressed with renewables, we are focused on reducing emissions that come from heating our buildings, so natural gas and steam. As we reduce these sources of air pollution, we will be improving air quality within environmental justice populations near our campuses. Next. We are aggressively addressing emissions from BU's largest emitters. The Center for Advanced Biomedical Research on the left at 700 Albany Street was our largest emitter. We just completed a 3-year, multi-million-dollar project to upgrade the mechanical systems, which we expect to reduce emissions from this building by more than 45%. On the right is Warren Towers at 700 Comm Ave, the second largest non-military dorm in the country. This building was built in the 60s without insulation and is our second largest emitter. We just begun construction, and over the next 3 years, we will be completely removing this building from the university's carbon footprint. We are taking this building from the university's second largest emitter to a non-emitter. Next. BERDO focuses on emissions that come from operating existing buildings. However, 28% of annual building sector emissions come from building buildings. At BU, we are addressing this embodied carbon for new construction and major renovations. Here are 3 examples. As we develop an update to the Climate Action Plan, embodied carbon will be integrated into our process. Back to operational carbon for a moment, if I may. In a letter we received from the Boston Planning Department and Interagency Green Building Committee, they noted, quote, "With the completion of the Warren Towers renovation, Boston University will have the largest concentration of zero net carbon buildings in Boston, and likely the whole Northeast." End of quote. And now we are moving forward with the design process for the Pardee School, which will be in the same neighborhood and another net zero carbon building at the Pardee School. Next. The university's mission is education and research. An important part of that mission is a focus on sustainability and climate change. A sample of the programs and opportunities include BU Sustainability, Earth House, and the Institute for Global Sustainability, with its key research on carbon-free Boston, which ultimately led to the creation of BERDO 2.0 and net zero carbon zoning. Next. The university has an impressive number of academic and research programs focused on sustainability, including hundreds of sustainability-related courses across many degree programs and numerous climate-related sustainability research opportunities for our students. The university also boasts dozens of student groups involved with climate change, energy, environmental justice, and sustainability to build the climate change workforce we all need. To supercharge that workforce development, we launched the Campus Climate Lab for students to collaborate with faculty and staff to implement climate action projects of their design on our campuses. Next. The university participates in environmental and sustainability programs advanced by the City of Boston and in the region. including bringing the community on campus to share what we have been doing and what we have been learning. I co-chair the Boston Green Ribbon Commission's Higher Ed Working Group and have participated in the technical advisory groups for BERDO, Net Zero Carbon Zoning, and Boston's Zero Waste Advisory Committee. On campus, we host the Sustainability Festival, Earth Month, Student Sustainability Leaders and Liaisons, the Sustainability Innovation Seed Grant Program, and much more. For more detail, I invite you to review the BU Sustainability website, the sustainability section of BU's institutional master plan, our climate action and zero waste plans, ASHE's Sustainable Tracking Assessment and Rating Systems reports, and the BU Sustainability Annual Report. Next. I want to thank you all for the important work you're doing on the review board and for reviewing our portfolio and ICS applications. Gabrielle and I would be more than happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for the presentation. Before we move on to questions, I'm going to hand it back to city staff for some additional comments.
Great, thank you. I will be doing the staff comments on this application, and thank you for the presentation, Dennis and Gabrielle. Sorry, I have an extra guest, so apologies for the extra noise. Diana, can you go to the next slides? Okay. So I want to provide a few comments and context on something that Gabrielle raised, and that is in BU's application, which is the use of Mass Department of Environmental Protection DEP's emissions factors, and some information about our electric grid and our electric grid emissions factors that we use in BERDO. So just some context setting to start. Massachusetts is part of a regional electric grid that is serves all of New England. So this is you can see a map of this, and it's also connected to adjacent grids in New York and in Canada. ISO New England is the entity that operates the regional grid and manages wholesale electricity markets. So they manage the whole electric grid and all the generation that happens, and imports as well. Next slide. Thank you for bearing with me. Hey, can you go get a crayon? Another reminder is just what an emissions factor is, which represents how clean or dirty a fuel source is. This gets more complicated for electricity because we get electricity from generation that happens across our electric grid. So that includes, power plants that are natural gas, nuclear generation, all the renewable generation, and that has to all get added together to know what our emissions are for the whole electric grid. Next slide. So in the adopted policies for BERDO, there are a few points around individual compliance schedules and how we advise applicants to consider their baseline emissions and specifically emissions factors for the electric grid. So first point is that emissions factors for the electric grid shall correspond to the historical emissions factors published by ISO New England, and if available, use emissions factors including net imports to the ISO New England grid. Additionally, the policies say that owners may propose alternative emissions factors to the review board, and the review board shall have discretion to accept or deny alternative emissions factors. And so just to completely spell it out, BU has proposed using an alternative emissions factor for grid electricity for their application. And so that is one of the decisions that the board needs to make in their vote on this application, is whether to approve that alternative emissions factor. Okay, next slide. So just a bit of comparison of the differences in the emissions factors for what we use in BERDO, which is the ISO New England emissions factor, and then the Massachusetts DEP emissions factor. So they're both like appropriate to use, but they're looking at slightly different things. So the ISO New England factor looks at all of the emissions associated with the electricity generated in New England. So adding up, as I said, all of the natural gas plants that are used to connect to the grid, all the nuclear, all the renewables, all of the generation, the emissions associated with that get summed up to the ISO New England emissions factor. What the Mass DEP emissions factor is doing is they look specifically at the electricity consumed in Massachusetts alone. So rather than everything generated on the grid, that one is looking at all the electricity that has been supplied to Massachusetts. Okay. All the electricity supplied to Massachusetts, what the emissions associated with that are. So that is a more complicated calculation than what ISO New England has. And hey, can you go get me the bike? And because of that, it takes a while for Mass DEP to complete those calculations. So that data is typically delayed 2 to 3 years following the calendar year. So for example, the latest published data from Mass DEP is from 2022. So with ISO New England, they officially publish their reports 10 to 12 months following the calendar year. So there's still a delay. However, the the raw data of like the hourly generation and their associated emissions data from ISO New England is available for download from the Energy Information Administration basically immediately. So we are able to calculate for BERDO an annual grid emissions factor based on ISO New England data as soon as the year is over. And so that is what we use for to determine emissions compliance going forward, because it's if we're doing an annual compliance, we need an annual emissions factor. And that is why the 2 to 3 year delay for Mass DEP has made that data source unusable for forward looking emissions compliance for BERDO. I know that's a lot there, and I have a screaming participant with me, so happy to answer questions about this if none of that was clear. And then just the next slide, Diana. So this is a comparison of the baseline emissions year that if we use the BERDO recommended ISO New England with imports emissions factors for the baseline years provided by BU versus the ones that BU proposed, which are the Mass DEP emissions factors, you can see that the BERDO recommended emissions factors are lower. So that would set a lower baseline than what is proposed and would be more consistent and in line with the emissions factors that we use throughout BERDO. Next slide. So because of this, for consistency across BERDO, staff are recommending that the board reject the use of Mass DEP emissions factors and request that BU update their ICS calculations and emission standards with ISO New England data published by BERDO. So that would be inclusive of the imports. And that's all I have for staff comments. So thank you to the board and thank you to BU. Happy to answer questions from anyone.
Great. Thank you. So I think we'll move into the board member questions, and I guess based on Hannah, what you just said, I think the majority of questions probably geared towards the team from Boston University, but it sounds like you're open to taking some additional questions from the board. Okay. I am first in the alphabet, but as chair, I will push myself to the bottom of the list. And I'll first ask board member Coletta Zapata if you have any questions.
Yes, thank you so much. What do I call you? Madam Chair, Madam Interim Chair. I appreciate it, and I appreciate BU's presentation, and just again, thank you to the phenomenal staff of BERDO for that informative presentation as well. I think it's pretty clear that accurate emissions accounting is foundational to BERDO's regulatory framework. And so we have to just make sure that we're ensuring consistency across all covered buildings. And BU, I know that you proposed using Mass DEP's emission factors, arguing that they better represent Massachusetts emissions. I think based on the presentation from our staff, I think I certainly understand now that it provides a more localized snapshot and diverges from BERDO's standard methodology. And I do think that raises concerns for me about the regulatory consistency that I brought up. And so just curious to know from BU, how do you justify the proposed use of Mass DEP's emission factors, and how would recalculating emissions with the ISO New England data impact your compliance projections?
I'll start, and Gabrielle, you can fill in. So in 2009, when we established a sustainability office, we started reporting publicly. Well, it was in 2010 when we started reporting publicly our emissions. We report to the ASHE STARS, that's the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Ed's Sustainable Tracking Assessment and Rating System. It's like LEAD for campuses, so it deals with all of our research and curriculum and everything we're doing operationally and a whole lot more. So we wanted to be as accurate as possible and as transparent. We had it's essentially a higher emissions factor than the ISO New England grid is, as Hannah walked through. So we would like to be consistent across all of our reporting. And I should mention that there are other reporting organizations that take that STARS data. So we would need to go back and change our emissions factors and really change everything we do in terms of the reporting. So it's quite a lot for us to change. I do appreciate the value that having an emissions factor that is consistent across other BERDO reporting and has a shorter timeline between the time that you have the data and the time you're reporting. So that 2 to 3 year issue is one that we discussed during the development of the regulations, as well as the value of ISO New England versus the accuracy and value of Mass DEP. So we feel like it's more accurate, and I will say that it's changing. It's all changing, so it's hard to know what the future holds. But I will say it's not that relevant as we look forward, because now that we're matching 100% of our electricity with renewable energy, we aren't getting renewable energy. We're not having to deal with that emissions factor delay. Gabrielle, do you want to add anything to that?
No, Dennis, I think that covers it pretty well.
Counselor, do you have any additional questions?
I think so. Maybe come back around. I would love to hear from city staff as well, maybe with a response. It can be now or it can be later, but I'll yield my time and want to have other folks ask their questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Hannah or Diana from the city, do you have any additional comments in response to the counselor's question?
Yeah, I appreciate the additional explanation from Dennis. Like I said, it's like they're both like appropriate emissions factors. It's just kind of the decisions we had to make for BERDO, and like operationalizing BERDO is where we've settled on the ISO New England emissions factors rather than Mass DEP. I think the other like appreciate how out ahead BU is on the renewable energy procurement. And I think that the piece that I would just add is, because of the ICS and the way that it's designed, is that the baseline sets the emissions limits going forward. And so because the ICS requires that 50% emissions reduction by 2030. So while going forward, the electricity emissions for BU will be 0 because of the power purchase agreement that they have. It is important to get that baseline accurate and have it kind of be consistent across BERDO and how we do look at the emissions factors going forward. And as for what will be like the reporting that goes into BERDO, just for clarification, we take just the building owners are reporting their energy use, so BU would report their energy use, and the way that it would work now is that we would apply the ISO New England emissions factors that apply to all BERDO buildings going forward. Because I don't think, and Dennis, correct me if I'm wrong, but that you weren't proposing like using Mass DEP going forward for BERDO compliance, or is that something that you are?
We would definitely. I mean, if we're using Mass DEP as the base, we need to be consistent across the timeline. So certainly we would want to be consistent. And if for some reason we didn't have renewable energy and needed to report based on Mass DEP, we would be reporting on Mass DEP.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the places that I have some questions about, and just like operationally, since we don't have like, let's just take 2025, we're reporting next year, 2026. We wouldn't have an emissions factor to apply to any electricity not covered by that power purchase agreement. Because the Mass DEP factor wouldn't be available. So I think that that's just one of the concerns that I have. And I think additionally, I think you're in a bit of a unique situation where you do have that power purchase agreement in place. But one of the concerns that I have from like the staff perspective is just like precedent setting as well. And, that we wouldn't be able to accommodate using an emissions factor for annual compliance that is not available annually.
Okay.
I'm just gonna move us to the next board member just to keep things moving time-wise. So board member Ferris, do you have any questions?
Yes, thank you. I have 2 questions, one related to the emissions factors and one related to the portfolio approach. I'll start maybe with the emissions factors. And I guess my question, and in your response, please feel free to let me know if this is redundant. And firstly, I guess also I appreciate BU's leadership and your presentation. What you've accomplished on the campus is very impressive. Regarding the emissions factors, I'm thinking about how the baseline, how using the New England, the Mass numbers to establish a baseline might be kind of inequitable compared to other owners if you're establishing a higher baseline. And so your reduction, your 50% reduction gives you a higher threshold than perhaps other owners who are using the New England grid emissions factors. And I was, because as you already said, your power purchase agreement allows you to basically cancel out any future emissions from electric, assuming that the renewables continue. So I was wondering if you had any comment about that kind of that slight bonus in your, like that leniency in your 50% reduction from a higher baseline.
Well, it is a higher baseline. Gabrielle, do you want to?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. The higher baseline does provide us additional flexibility in our targets to be transparent. I think that's where the future looking comes in and subjecting ourselves to Mass DEP moving forward, so that if we were ever in a situation where BU wind did not exist, we would be subjected to those higher emissions factors at that time, which would then sort of equal out the additional flexibility that we've given ourselves with the baseline.
Okay, but just to clarify, you don't intend, you intend to maintain the power purchase agreement to offset 100% of your electricity. So that's sort of a continuing.
Yes, and we've written into the contracts that BERDO buildings will be prioritized for BU wind before our other buildings on campus.
Great. Thank you. Do I have time for another question, Jessica? Okay. My other question is about the portfolio decarbonization, and I was wondering how you mentioned a few of the capital projects that you're undertaking to reduce emissions at the building scale. I'm wondering what plans you have to decarbonize your 2 utility plants.
Great question. We have 2 utility plants, but we also have a large portfolio of buildings that are not on utility plants, including those that get steam from vicinity. And I mentioned in the latter part of the presentation that we're revisiting our climate action plan, and really not to reset goals, but to really look at the strategies for achieving the goals. So it's a portfolio approach looking at, well, we're not there yet. We won't have the plan complete until the end of the year, we hope, because we just launched it in January. But what seems to be floating to the top is really, frankly, no surprise. Energy efficiency, and then decarbonizing emissions where we can for heating, at a building scale, as well as looking at where there may be opportunities for thermal energy networks with geothermal as a supplement to that thermal energy network, because we'll have a much higher coefficient of performance for that group of buildings. So that is generally how we're looking at approaching that. And it's really looking at where we can get the most reduction per dollar spent.
Thank you.
I'm going to move forward and then I can come back to double check. But Board Member Lattimore, do you have any questions?
Thank you. I've been listening intently to the questions that, were similar to questions that I had that other board members have asked and that have been answered and responded to by both BU and the city. I agree that it is an impressive presentation. I have some questions about the EJ narrative piece, but I'm not sure if it belongs in this conversation or in the building. If this is all part of one and the same, the ICS. So if someone can clarify that, that would be helpful.
It's a single conversation.
Single. Thank you. Because it's so unique. This proposal is so layered. So thank you. And like my colleague, I had a question about an individual capital project that was described in the EJ narrative, and it was the 700 Albany Street building where there was mention of an HVAC replacement. And I just wondered what that replacement was composed of, meaning what are the elements of that HVAC replacement and how much of the annual emissions that were mentioned there. I heard you talk about a 45% reduction in emissions because of the work being done, if I'm not mistaken, at 700 Albany. But in the proposal, in the plan, the EJ plan, it also talked about 700 Albany along with 700 Commonwealth. And I just wondered how much of the annual emissions that were spoken to in the plan will be for the 700 Albany only. So what were the HVAC replacement elements and how much of the annual emissions would be for how much of the annual emissions will be for 700 Albany itself? That's just
great question. So the project, which has now been completed, was to replace 2 air handling units, rebuild 2 other air handling units, replace the building automation controls to enable energy reduction by properly controlling air exchanges, and then installing a centralized roof exhaust plenum for energy heat recovery coils. So when that when the ventilation air goes out of the building, we're pulling thermal energy off of that airflow. And this is really a strategy that we're looking at doing more and more and more. Eventually, we have the opportunity to combine that with a water source heat pump so that we could do heating and cooling from that water, that thermal flow through that. So that's coming out as part of our climate action plan update. But to answer your question, the building itself, we're looking at about a 45% reduction in energy consumption and emissions associated with that. Let me be clear, 45% reduction in emissions from that project for that building. And that is one of many, but I don't know what the percentage would be when we look at that as the total portfolio. I would say it's, I'm not even going to guess. It's not a large amount of the total portfolio, but it's a large amount for that building and enabling additional decarbonization work.
And how or if are residents involved in the EJ neighborhood? Say, for example, that 700 Albany one. It's not far from the heart of Roxbury. How are residents, if at all, involved in BU sustainability work and the in particular around these kind of BERDO building capital issues, if at all?
Well, I will say that at a large scale, when we look at our entire project, our entire work, we're regularly engaging with our community outside BU as well as the community inside BU. But if we're looking specifically at 700 Albany Street, there hasn't been a major communication or engagement with the community. We just felt that by reducing the emissions for that building, we're improving air quality in that neighborhood.
I don't have any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Board Member Stovall, do you have questions?
I just wanted to ask, you did a retrofit on your turbines and steam turbines in 2006, I read. How long, what is the lifespan on that retrofit? I mean, what is the lifespan on that plant itself? I'm just curious.
The lifespan, good question. The lifespan is long. That's equipment that's been around for a long time. It's nothing's easily done here, but it can be upgraded, retrofitted with new technology, or as older technology needs to be replaced, that can be updated on a boiler by boiler basis or as a whole system like we did back in 2006.
So when you finish up, basically that retrofit is going to be 34 years old, right? When you're finished with everything in 2040, right?
Yeah. And so there is an opportunity there. Actually, when we were developing the climate action plan initially, we were looking at the lifespan of when an investment is going to need to be made in our central plants, and what is the opportunity to change that technology to a lower carbon technology. So I think that's part of the work we're doing now in our climate action plan update to understand how that work will fold into all the other work that we're doing and where that sits on that longer timeline. But I think you're bringing up a really important point. How do we take advantage of an investment that we need to make in the future and in making investing right as we go?
I mean, I understand you had to do it right at the beginning because of the amount of pollution and carbon that was going into the air, but at the end of the project, it's probably going to be somewhat behind times, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, the times have been changing fast, thankfully.
Yeah.
And I look forward to an opportunity to be able to retrofit that. And as we look at the potential for as I mentioned earlier, thermal energy networks and perhaps really decarbonizing on a building scale. I mean, the central plants is a really important place for us to be focusing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I have two questions, follow-ups, mostly from fellow board member questions. One is, I know board member Lattimore asked a little bit about the community engagement. And I just, if you could clarify what the public engagement was on the initial climate action plan and the update,
Sure.
that would be great.
Yeah, so when we did the climate action plan, we invited the broader community. We had forums held on both the medical campus and the Charles River campus, where we had over 150 people joining the one on the Charles River campus. I don't remember the numbers on the medical campus, but there were many members of the broader community, particularly those that are interested in addressing climate change, who attended those. As we go forward, we will be holding more forums in the update to the climate action plan. And I will also say that we've engaged the city of Boston when we did the initial climate action plan and intend to do the same this time around, as well as our utilities. Our utilities are important partners in this work, and we all need to be working on this toward the same goals together.
Great, thank you. And then going back to the very beginning about some of our questions about ISO versus Mass DEP, one thing that it would be helpful to clarify is you had talked about how it would be, a fair amount of work to transfer from one system to another, but it would also be helpful to understand, do you have, outside of BERDO, are there additional reporting obligations that you have to internal or external bodies that are indexed on ISO indexed on Mass DEP versus ISO? So like if you were doing if you did switch over to the ISO for the city of Boston, would you be able to switch that for all of your requirements, or would you need to be continuing to report on Mass DEP to some other body?
No, there's not another body that we would need to do that kind of reporting. I think the main concern I have is the amount of time it will take for us to update, because we're going to need to go back to those base years. In 2006 is what we typically set for all of our sustainability metrics. Gabrielle's sort of walked through how BERDO is differentiated based on when we acquired properties and when we were able to get good data. But no, to answer your question, there isn't another party that is requiring that we're using the Mass DEP numbers. It would just mean that we'll have to go back and reset our bases for reports that go back into history.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I appreciate that that this has been an in-depth conversation about a complicated body of work, and also that there may be some members of the public who've come for the public comment period. So just want to quickly ask if there's a show of hand, if any board member has a specific question that you were unable to ask in the first round. We can do those now, and if not, we can move to the public comment period. All right, great. So we will we'll move to the public comment period. Just a reminder that we welcome any public comments, that this is a comment period more than a Q&A period. So if people have questions that you're interested in the board or city staff considering or following up on, you can put those in the meeting chat. if possible, but ideally the sort of open public comment portion will primarily be for comments. Of course, if you have an important question, you can throw it in there, but we do have the chat function for that. So we're gonna transition to that public comment period. I will open things up for public comment and invite people to raise their hands. All right. I will seeing no hands, I think we can close the public comment period, looking for a nod from city staff. All right, great. Thank you, and thanks to all the members of the public who have attended today. So I will open it up to the floor to ask board members if there is a motion that we want to take today on BU's application.
If it's helpful, Chair, not to put Hannah back on the spot, we're also happy to reiterate staff comments if that's helpful. I know it seemed like Councilor Coletta Zapata had mentioned maybe something like that.
Yes, Hannah, if you want to do that, or to pull up the slide with your recommendation. I don't know if we can go backwards. That might be helpful too.
Yeah, I'm happy to just reiterate this. Again, I appreciate the discussion. Again, our recommendation is to request that BU update their ICS with the ISO New England emissions factors, including imports that we publish for historic emissions factors. But again, if the board has clarifying questions on that, or anything else that was shared, happy to answer those.
I move to take the city's recommendation, albeit that Boston University has done some very impressive work. The city has some concerns regarding using the Mass DEP emissions factor. So I move to take the city's recommendations to reject the use of Mass DEP emissions factors and request that BU update their ICS calculations and emission standards based on the ISO New England data.
You, board member Lattimore, do we have a second for that motion?
I'll second.
Thank you. So I will I'll move us to a vote. I vote in favor. Councilor Coletta Zapata.
In favor.
Board member Ferris.
In favor.
Board member Lattimore.
In favor.
Board member Stovall.
In favor. We have to stay organized.
Right. I want to thank the Boston University team for your work and your presentation. I believe we're going to move to some staff follow-up from here.
Yes, I can reach out with the BU team to get the updated ICS reduction schedule, and we can coordinate from there.
Seeing as it's 6, oh, sorry. Yeah, Dennis.
I just want to understand the process a little more here. We have a portfolio and ICS application, so I'm assuming, Diana, that we need to provide the updated emissions factors calculations across our portfolio. And then I guess the question is, once you receive that, can you approve it, or do we need to go back to another hearing? How does this work?
Yes, that's a great question. I believe we'll need to have another hearing because the way the motion language was made, it wasn't an approval pending or contingent upon the ICS recalculation, and so we will have a continuation essentially of this application.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to clarify, they'll be I think because it's a pathway 3, they're considered together. So we'll ask for that updated application, then it will be a continued hearing, and then the board will be able to vote based on that updated application.
Okay. Thank you.
I guess I should say, but it would be a much shorter hearing since the bulk of the presentation and information happened today.
So, thanks very much for your time and for your thorough answers. I I guess kind of a point of order. I think we probably have time to vote on the minutes from our last meeting, but I also appreciate that Board Member Ellis was the official chair and recused himself for this conversation. So I'm happy to lead it if that's consistent. With our process.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think the language was just for the BU
Yeah.
application. So I think if he's not rejoining, I think we should just adjourn the meeting and vote on minutes next time.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
if that's okay with board members, we can hold approving the minutes for the following meeting. And I can move into providing very quick administrative updates. So yeah, moving into administrative updates very quickly. I just wanted to give an update. We are chugging along. The city of Boston is chugging along with reviewing applications for flexibility measures. We received 2 updates or sort of updated applications for hardship compliance plans. As a reminder, we review them and then we provide feedback to applicants. And then they have an opportunity to make changes or updates based on our feedback. So we have 2 of those. Just wanted to give an update from the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund or recipients from last year. Everyone should have either received or are receiving their first payment for their fund or for their award, and we've received March updates on all the projects, so things seem to be running smoothly there. The BERDO team is hosting a series of webinars. So we've had 2 so far, one on hardship compliance plans, one on the launch of the 2025 BERDO reporting and emissions compliance period. And we have one coming up next week on renewable energy. We also have another one on condo associations and BERDO compliance. And then finally one on building portfolios and individual compliance schedules for 2026. And the registration link is here on the slide deck. We also are hosting in-person BERDO neighborhood workshops. So this week we are hosting 2 of them. One what we're calling Downtown Plus. So it's Chinatown, Downtown, North End, Beacon Hill, and the West End in the Civic Pavilion on Boston City Hall Plaza. We're hosting another one in South Boston at the South Boston branch of the Boston Public Library. We're hosting another one in April for Roxbury, Dorchester, and South End in the Bowling Building in Roxbury, and we're hoping to have one in Fenway and Back Bay coming soon. I think we just finalized the location for that, so more details to come. But these are basically opportunities for any building owners to come in person, speak with a BERDO staff person in person. We recognize sometimes it's just easier to get your questions answered by a human than over email. And walk-ins are welcome, but we do encourage people to RSVP if possible. Allows us a little bit more give us an idea of what kind of questions people are coming with, and we can be better prepared. Just a reminder, April 1st is the deadline for long-term hardship compliance plan applications for 2026. So for the hardship compliance plan application to be in effect essentially for the year 2026. And then our next meeting is tentatively scheduled for April 14. Well, scheduled for April 14, not tentatively. I'm not sure why I said that. And yeah, and then the schedule for the next couple of dates. And then, sorry, just one last reminder. Um, the last meeting, the board voted to hold a hearing for BMC. So if you have any questions for BMC that you would like to see in their presentation, please send them to me. I will make sure that BMC gets them. And that's it for admin updates. And now acting chair, I know you're serving sort of chair pro tem, but typically then we ask if there's a motion to adjourn. So maybe
Yeah.
you can do that.
Can I have a motion to adjourn
So moved.
in a second?
Second.
Thank you. And so either by a raised hand or an in favor, we can take a vote to adjourn.
Aye.
So everybody just wants to say aye.
Aye.
All right, it looks like we definitely have quorum. Do we need Counselor Coletta to vote? Okay, all right, excellent. Thank you, everyone.
Aye.
Thank you to the staff and thanks to my fellow board members.
Have a great
Thank
week.
you.
Thank you, everyone.